Hi, this is Michael Jacobs, and I'd like to welcome you to another year of Jacobs 3D Golf. This year is a special one and super exciting. As you're probably aware, my new book, Science of the Golf Swing, is now available. This 339-page book is an unabridged version of the kinetics that drive the golf club. It's a culmination of the work that I've done with Dr. Stephen Nesbitt in refining exactly how the golfer moves the club. So the true physics of what's happening is contained in the book. The book grew to be quite large, so therefore the subject of work and power will be its own publication later this year. As we start to move on from here, and we move into what our full body model called Alpha Man, we will start to then marry what you are going to learn now about the inputs and drivers of the club to the different segments of the body. So for the first time in the history of our sport, when the golf club gets moved a certain way, let's say you're a struggling golfer and you have the tendency to come way over the top or outside in, as it's commonly called, we'll be able to pinpoint which segments of your body are the ones that are fully responsible for driving the club in that manner versus what you're trying to achieve, and how that player, let's say a good example of what you're trying to do, is driving their segments of the body. And for the first time, we'll be able to go through 17 links of the body and marry it all together. And it's super exciting, and it's super intense in its study. So as I probably stand before you a year or two from now, we'll probably have Science of the Swing 2, the full body model. But let's put our focus on the club, because that's what I think we need to bring everybody up to speed on. So what have we learned so far? Well, I'm going to grab a golf club along with a little idea I came up with to help you understand the rotations and the kinetic drivers that drive a golf club. I think you're probably familiar with the terms alpha, beta, and gamma that Dr. Nesbitt used to describe the rotations of the club. Now, what does that mean? They sound like fancy terms, they're just Greek letters, but really the equivalent and how you might want to think about them is yaw, pitch, and roll of an airplane. So that's why I took an airplane, and I used an airplane example quite a lot in the new Science of the Swing book to help you learn the different rotations of the club. Most golfers didn't even know that the club rotated during a swing. I mean, most people thought of the rolling rotation and trying to square the club up, but the other two rotations were news to a lot of people. And I think it's really important that you understand this if you're going to take your understanding of the golf swing to another level. Okay, so I think everybody's familiar, or I hope everybody's familiar at this point, with alpha rotation of the club. And all alpha rotation of the club is a yawing action side to side of the club. So just like this airplane, it would be the wings yawing side to side at whatever pitch altitude it's on. So that would be alpha is yaw. Beta would be pitch. So what that means is if I had this airplane and I nosed it up or I nosed it down, that would be the pitching action of the club. And you could see that there is quite a bit of pitching action in a golf swing, and there's a lot of yawing action as well. And the third type of rotation is roll or gamma, and that would be not too pleasant on an airplane. Maybe if you're a fighter pilot, but so that would be your roll. So we have yaw, pitch, and roll, and that's really all the alpha, beta, gamma is. Now, what you have to understand is that when I drive the club, and I'm holding on to the club and I'm imposing my will at the grip, and I'm starting to bring the club back and down and all the things we try to do in a golf swing and move our body around, we are managing this yaw, pitch, and roll of the club. And there are ways that are optimal for different players, and I cover that in the book. But the goal of this first show here of the year, it's called Components of Force, or the drivers that force the club. Let's examine them a little deeper. So in the Fundamental Elements book, the only discussion relative to force that we had was the sum of the forces applied by the golfer. So we had those spirals with the quiver pointing out, showing you the sum of the forces that the golfer was applying to the club and how they change in direction and magnitude. And people got used to seeing those. But for the true kinetic story and to really break down swing changes, what we have to do is we have to identify the components of the force so that we can go piece by piece into making swing changes, especially with all the different segments of the body. And I kind of made it clear in this book that the joints of the body and the way that the human body goes to swing a golf club does not align well with the pitch, roll, and yaw of the golf club, especially up at the top. So that's why it's super important to break down each kinetic driver. Okay, so what are the components of the force? Well, what we choose to do is, after we have resolved what this club is doing relative to the room, let's say, we then take the mass center of the club and then we break it down into alpha, beta, and gamma. So we have an alpha, a beta, and a gamma, and this is all laid out nicely in the pictures in the book. So those three axes are what we're describing when we're talking about the kinetic driver. So if I took this handle of the club and I drove it towards the camera like this, so essentially what I'm doing is I'm forcing the tail of the club, or the tail of the plane I should say, up, and that would be an alpha force. This would be, in our convention, a positive alpha force. And it does two things. It drives the mass center, right? It pushes, linearly accelerates it towards the camera. But because I'm at a distance from the mass center, the alpha, beta, gamma ball, the club will also rotate. And the rotation that it's inducing is that pitching rotation. So you can see when I push the tail up, the nose wants to nose down. Vice versa, if I push the tail down, the club is going to want to accelerate towards me this way, and it's also going to want to nose up. So what you need to understand is when you force the grip of the club up or down, you're going to make the club rotate nose up, nose down. We call this an alpha force, and then the rotation that gets created, nose up, nose down, the pitching rotation, is called beta rotation. And when you're looking at the true kinetic, there's also torque. So if I went like this and I drove the handle like that and the nose went down, this thing would continue like this, but you could see I'm holding it in my hands and stopping it from going too much. So that means I'm applying a torque back this way to offset that. So it's combinations of forcing and torquing in what we would call here the beta plane of motion. And I think what's going to be interesting is for you to understand that if you're looking at the true kinetic, this action of alpha forcing and beta torquing is always the same throughout the motion. So no matter what the orientation of the club or this plane is, the action of alpha forcing and beta torquing always has the same relationship, and that's the way kinetics have to be done. Next would be yawing the club side to side. So this would be alpha rotating, but also if I take this grip or this wing and I push it forward, it's going to make the mass center want to accelerate this way, which it'll do, but it's also going to create a levering action that makes this thing yaw this way as I do that. This is a negative beta force creating a negative alpha rotation, so a negative yawing. So if you're coming into impact and you really push the grip or the tail of this plane very much this way, your club is going to want to yaw back like this, and then you're going to have to do things to try to get it to come around and square up, so to speak. And then if I took this tail or this grip and I pulled it back, it's going to make the center of mass accelerate this way, but it's also going to yaw the club or the plane that way. And this is your beta force and your alpha rotation, we call it, which is yaw. And then we have the ability to torque along with that, and that adds up to be all the drivers. And finally, we have the gamma force, which is our predominant force, and that force is either going to make the plane go towards me or away from me. And during the swing, because this club is continually curving, that direction of that force is always away from the center of mass. So, and I can't leave out gamma torque, of course, right? So if I then roll the plane this way and this way, you could see I would get a gamma rolling action. Now, what's interesting is when I force it in the gamma direction, the center of mass of the club is here, so there's not much rotation induced. There's little small amounts of rotation that are secondary, and the real rotational drivers of force are the beta force and the alpha force at rotating the club. So what do you take from this? It sounds kind of complicated, but it's really not, because if you're going to improve, you have to marry this together. And I talk about how to take your grip relative to this type of setting. So when I flex extend my wrists, I like to see predominantly yawing action. If I take a really strong grip, my left hand on top, right hand on the bottom, when I go to flex and extend my wrist, you can see the plane does all kinds of strange things. So this will definitely help you manage the rotation of the club a lot better. Now, it's become popular to, what I want to do now is I want to talk about a backswing thing, a transition swing, and a downswing thing. And then I'll let everybody read this book and enjoy it. And then we'll continue with the whole series this year, going through each part of the book, because it's dense material. It's unabridged. I went all out in this, so I hope you enjoy it. Now, on the backswing, on the takeaway, most players do not apply enough positive alpha force on the takeaway. What do I mean by that? Well, they don't take the tail of the plane or the grip and bring it up enough early in the backswing. What most players are doing, because they heard they should have a low and slow takeaway, or take it back to the inside, or whatever they're trying to do, or get the club face to match their spine, whatever the case may be, they usually don't apply enough alpha force to get the club high enough at this point. So I recommend for my students, when we work with the airplane here, is that we pull up on the tail enough that the nose is as high as my hands at this point in the backswing, or somewhere close to that, as opposed to bringing it back and keeping the nose down that much. That's when you start to see other things. So that's a neat little takeaway advice. In the other directions of the takeaway, what's interesting is the variability between how many golfers actually will force it this way as they go back, and how many golfers actually force it this way and bank it around with what we call a negative beta force. And that's quite common, believe it or not, that on the backswing they bank it around with a negative beta force. You'll see that in some tour players whose wrists are up like this. And then when they come down, what you have to understand is you have to undo it in a totally different way than if you're somebody who did more of, let's say, a uniform rotation of the club. So I often see people trying to copy movements in the body and not even paying attention to what the rotation of the club looks like. So all that has to be factored in if you're going to make a swing change or bring the body together with the club. Transition area. Right around this point in the backswing, this is just to give you some highlights of kinetics. right around this point in the backswing, we will, if we can make a big enough backswing, we will start to push the tail this way. So that would be the equivalent of pushing the tail down if it was in front of me like this. Pushing the tail down, which makes our component of force point up like this. We're curving it around this way, so the predominant forcing direction as we go up towards the top, if we summed all the forces together, they'd be pointed this way. And depending on if I forced it behind me or more in front of me, right, that some of the forces quiver would tilt side to side depending on what you do. And then once, because we use height of the handle, or height of the hands as the top of the backswing, so this club is still going back, so when the body starts to make its move, right, the club is still moving back, so these components of force and these kinetics are maintained through that area, and that's a real good way to look at transition. But if you're somebody who can't bring the club up enough and you only make a backswing to here, you're forfeiting all this extra leverage that you could create when you do that. Now I'd like to give you one little tip and something interesting that you could start to use before you read the book, and it comes in the mail, and that's on the downswing. A lot of talk over the past bunch of years has been how you could torque the club going into impact. And I think the big confusion, well, I know the big confusion over the past 4 years, and I'm not going to comment on it until now, I was waiting for my book to be published, is that when you look at the true kinetic, regardless of where you are in the swing, the kinetic is the kinetic. So if I beta force, or if I push this forward and the yaw's back, I have to torque this way, and that's regardless of where it is. So it is quite popular nowadays for on the backswing, for folks as they come up towards the top of the backswing. I see a lot of students trying to do this, where they will force the club and try to send the center mass of the club as far behind them as they can. So they'll come up like this, and then they'll be trying to push the center of mass of the club further back. Now, a couple things. Number one, the more you push, the more you get that center of mass to go back behind you this way, the more force you're going to have this way to get it to come around later. By definition, that force that you need to get it to come around later is a negative beta force, which is going to negatively alpha rotate the club, and you're going to have to torque through that. That's that blowback thing that we always talk about. So the more this is behind you, the more force you have to put this way, the more torque you're going to have, alpha torque. So I just want you to be aware of that. Now also, the route that the club takes when it gets behind you is, if I'm coming up near the top of the swing and I want to force the center of mass of the club more behind me, and I apply a positive beta force, and remember, if I go back to the beginning, this is our home plate here, we call it, and I pull the club this way, right? If I try to force the mass center back like this, the club is going to want to actually yaw like that. So positive beta force creates a positive alpha rotation. This is alpha now. Just because it's transported up here doesn't mean it's something different. So then as I come down, if I then bring that mass center back, you're probably going to, if you really want to lay this thing back, you're going to have to probably alpha torque it like this. So now you're in a situation where you're coming around, and I see this look a lot, and you're in this situation coming back or towards impact. And what you have to do to get this club to the ball at this point is you're obviously going to need to positive alpha force it, and you're also going to need to negatively beta force it and bank it around. And as you do that and you drive the club this way towards the ball, the yawing action continues to want to go back, and then you're going to have to positive alpha torque as you bank this around. So the more you put the club behind you, the more alpha torque you're going to have as you come into impact. That's what we've said, and that's why it's important. Now, the kinetic drivers of the swing are always the same, regardless of where they are. Yet when we look at things like displacement and swing angles and things like that from the fundamentals book, you have to learn to marry those kinetics with the kinematics from the fundamental book. And that's what I help you do in this Science of the Swing. So I really hope you're going to enjoy it. I just said a mouthful. This is introductory golf science. And, you know, everybody always says, is this stuff too complicated? I don't think so. I think this is a lot easier. And then when people, you know, stand here and they get a little airplane on their club, you're going to see the effects of what your kinetics are. And all what we're describing here is all instantaneous stuff. So no matter where we are, it's the instantaneous kinetic that you're applying that speeds up, slows the club down, and speeds up and slows down the rotation of the club. So everything's covered in full detail in Science of the Swing. I really hope you enjoy it, and I look forward to your feedback. The 2019 Jacobs 3D Golf School here on Long Island, our programs will be put up next week, and we'll be starting the season. We have a couple new things. We have a 1 and 2 day swing study that I think is really interesting. So if you're thinking about coming out to work on all this great stuff and see all this in action, I'm going to suggest that you look at those 2 new programs. Also, we're proud to be with Cleveland Strixon this next 2 years. And we have a really, I think it's got to be the most complete wedge fitting cart I think that they have. We have every possible wedge in there for a fitting. And what we're going to do is we're going to match all those to the kinetic. So if you come and you do a short game program or you do the swing study and we're fitting you for the wedges or the clubs, we're going to match it to the kinetic as we start to do more and more club fitting. So I hope you enjoy. Go get yourself an airplane. Put the alpha, beta, gamma ball on there, and learn to pitch, roll, and yaw. This is Michael Jacobs. I hope you enjoy Science of the Golf Swing.